Hey Amarillo, I'm Skylar Gallup, and you're listening to Hey Amarillo, the interview podcast featuring some of the most interesting people and stories of Amarillo, Texas. We record each week at the beautiful offices of Rosenbach Contractors, experts in high-end design and construction, creating stunning, functional spaces through both new builds and remodels. Today's guest is Clara Sneed. Clara's not from around here, but we'll forgive her for it because her roots and her care for the Panhandle go deep, way deep. Clara wrote and published Before We Turn to Dust, a historical fiction telling the story of an absolutely wild family feud that happened right here in Amarillo in the early 1900s. To add to the complexity, and there is plenty of that to go around, Clara's a descendant of one of the families that were involved. Her book is getting some really interesting attention, which I think you'll find very understandable once you hear about it. Here's Clara. Clara Sneed, welcome to the Hey Amarillo podcast.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
I am happy to have you. So we like to start kind of setting the foundation. Where are you from?
I was born in Austin, Texas. I'm fifth generation Texan, but my deeper roots are really about 90 miles northeast of Austin in Milam County and Robertson County. So.
Okay, great.
But I had a very peripatetic, moved around a lot as a child. So now.
Peripatetic. I don't know that word.
Peripatetic. You know, it's funny. I wrote it in my bio, and my editor said, "I've never heard that word." And I said, "We're going to use it because it's really the right word." And it is. It means you moved around a lot. You know, you wandered. Peripatetic is you wandered. So it's the exact right word. There was a lot of moving in my childhood. So I stayed very attached to Texas, but I've spent decades in California.
Well, thank you for teaching. I'm a word person. So
yeah, so there's a good one.
Peripatetic. There it is.
Yeah, Peripatetic.
Thank you. I read your bio and I wondered about it. So I'm glad we got to.
Madison was like, "Well, we shouldn't use this." I said, "Yeah, we can use it."
I love using the right word for it.
Yeah, it's the right word. It's the right word. So
perfect.
Okay.
So I know that. So talk about why you have ties to the Amarillo area.
Well, so essentially they're family ties, although I did not know this part of the world at all. This part of Texas I didn't know until I began to research this, which I did. I began in the 90s on this. It's been a really long project. And so the part of Texas I knew was much more central Texas, and we had gone back, and I had lived there as a child. But in part because of this whole family drama, I had not been to this part of Texas, although my father had been. All of my Texas roots are on my dad's side.
Okay.
And a whole lot of his father, my grandfather's, well, it was really all three of his siblings were living in the Amarillo area at the time all this stuff blew up. So my grandfather, who died in the 30s, so I never knew him, on my dad's side, is the youngest brother of these four siblings, three of whom were living in Amarillo. So there's actually a deep family connection for me in Amarillo, but I didn't know Amarillo until I started coming here in the 90s and researching it. So.
Okay, and so to kind of set the stage for, a lot of the conversation that we'll have today, you have written two books.
Yes.
About one fictional, one non-fictional, correct? About
full points. It's so hard to get straight. It is really hard for people. People are like, "What? What did she do?" It's very difficult. So full points on that. You got it straight. Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
Yes.
About this wild rift.
Yes. Yes.
Like family's feud, right?
Yes.
Like the Hatfields and the McCoys.
Yes, except that it doesn't get quite as hot as that. It starts hot and then it ends up in the judicial system. So in a way, although most people now would think the judicial outcomes were not just, it wasn't justice done, it's a kind of transitional justice in Texas because 30 years earlier, it would have just been bang, bang, shoot, shootout in the street. It would never have gone to the legal system. So although it's a feud, the fact that they were trying to get justice out of the legal system as opposed to just going out and, taking shots at somebody means it doesn't blow up to quite the Hatfield-McCoy stage. It's later historically, and as a result, it's less shoot 'em up. And the injustices are still there, and the feud was, I think, very live in Amarillo for a long time. Apparently, you couldn't be friends with both families. You had to pick after. But they were all friends to start out with, which is one of the great tragedies of the whole story, that these were deep family friendships that were just exploded by what happened. So,
So I'm going to ask you in a minute to kind of like tell me the story.
Sure.
First, though, I think early on, how interesting and I think super relevant to make the note that at the time, the outcomes being found in our justice system, although they were, from now's perspective, it sounds like unjust, quite progressive, in fact, that we were even finding outcomes in the judicial system.
Right. I think you have to look at, I think if you look at the legal system or the legal practices in Texas, you have to see what was going on with this one as being progress, even though the outcome is it's not a good outcome, but it's progress because they took the voices and the state took it to court. The outcome was not what I don't think anybody today would call it a just outcome. But after that, the killing stopped. So in that sense, it's, partly that is, and I make a point of this, entirely to the Boyces' credit. Their mother, I think in particular, and the sons, the remaining boys, just realized there was nothing to be gained by going after my great uncle. But I can't imagine how hard that restraint must have been, and how, especially for some of those boys, it must have really cost them not to go after him, because he'd killed their father and their brother and gotten completely off, acquitted for doing it. So it had to have been a very bitter thing for them.
I think the other thing that I want to kind of touch on before we hear kind of like what happened was actually, I think, kind of like a misstep that I made when I reached out to you about this, because the top line of the story is so drama filled and salacious and all of this. And in our first conversation, you kind of like checked me and was like, yeah, these were real people that were actually my family members.
Partly that reaction it's not checking you. It's all of us have that.
Right,
I would be the same way if I heard the story. Because I spent so much time researching it, and then even more because I spent so much time writing it as a novel, and the way that I'm telling it, it's very close in. So I had to get really close inside these characters. I couldn't not be aware of how much trauma was involved for all these people. And when the book came out, the novel, that was one of the distinctions I came up with in the interviews. Like, we all love the drama, right? Because sex and violence are perennially interesting to everybody.
Totally.
But these people are living through trauma, and that's for them, it's not drama, it's trauma. And it was terrible trauma for really, I think, so many people involved. And really, this is a story that's tragic on multiple levels for multiple people in multiple ways. And in the novel, I'm trying to really, it's a tragedy, but it's a multi-layered tragedy. So you're not alone. I would do the same thing in your position, but it's not only my family, but it's the other family as well. And there's been, the most amazing thing that's come out of this for me is that after these families were friends, became bitter enemies, and now the families, because of this, through me and some of the members, are becoming friends again, which is just lovely. It's just lovely. It's really lovely. It's like this kind of reconciliation and healing after decades, after more than 100 years of something so profoundly terrible, really horrible, just horrible, what happened. So.
Yeah. Okay. So can you give me a date, and then what happened?
Okay. So basically, these families, the Boyces, the Sneeds, and the wife's family of origin, the Snyders, were all friends. They had all, at one point or another, been in the Georgetown area in Texas. So the old men, as I call it, the fathers in the family had all known each other and in certain cases worked together. The Snyders and the Boyces and the Boyce dad had worked together. So the older generation is quite close. And when the younger generation was all around Georgetown, they all get to know each other. And in 1900, Beale Sneed, my great uncle, my grandfather's older brother, marries Lena Snyder, who is the daughter of Tom Snyder and the niece of J.W. and D.H., I think, Snyder, who, you could look up in the Handbook of Texas.
Read the book.
They were, no, the Handbook of, in the Handbook of Texas, they're the Handbook of Texas types, the Snyders. And I think Sam Bass got killed in D.H. Snyder's pasture or something in Round Rock, they're definitely. So Beale and Lena get married. The Albert Boyce Sr. was called the Colonel, and he was the manager of the big XIT ranch up here in the Panhandle. Cool. So he had his family up here. The ranch headquarters were at Channing. Lena and Beale ended up moving to Amarillo in 1905, and Al Boyce came back. He and his brother Lynn ran cattle, in Montana, and they'd been in the Pecos, and there was a big drought. And in the fall of 1910, Al Boyce Jr., the son of Colonel Boyce, came back into town and made his family's house on Polk Street the headquarters for the cattle business. And he and Lena got in contact again, and apparently fell crazy in love. And part of the reason I say it had to be crazy in love is because I know from having interviewed people back in the 90s, and Amarillo's grown a lot, but the core is still, it's a pretty small group, really.
It is a big, small town.
It's a big, small town, but that was even more true in the 90s.
Sure.
So it was much smaller. And I heard things about who was having affairs back in those days, and I think, people have always had affairs, and they don't always break up marriages. So, and if all you want to do is have an affair and have a little fun, you can do that. You don't need to break up your marriage. But they were so crazy in love that Lena went to Beale and told him she wanted a divorce, which wasn't unheard of at the time. This is 1911, fall of 1911. And all the family starts consulting. They're all up and down Polk Street consulting, and they end up deciding that the thing to do with her is to confine her to a sanitarium in Fort Worth, because she's clearly not well. And
not uncommon during that time.
No, and he had the complete right to do it. He could just say, my wife needs your medical attention, and that's the way it was going to be. And this came out a lot in the trial, what are they even doing with her? They took a while to diagnose her, and they finally diagnosed her as morally insane, which was an actual diagnosis back then. Always controversial, but that's and often, strangely enough, applied to women who were of a certain class and probably white and just weren't behaving the way it seemed like they ought to be behaving. So it's obviously kind of a bogus diagnosis,
totally.
But she was diagnosed with it.
She needed to quit all that.
And she figured out how to play the system a little bit, write these letters to Beale. I'm going to be a good girl. I want to come home. I'm like, I forgot to ask you what the cattle were getting, and I sure would remember to drain the radiators, because otherwise they might freeze. And and what about the floors? And I'd like to come home, and I really want to see the kids. They wouldn't let her see They wouldn't let her see your children. She had 2 daughters. They had 2 daughters by that time. But meanwhile, she's also writing to Al, who's over in Santa Rosa in New Mexico, for God's sakes, get me out of this place. And she manages to convince her nurse to be on her side. And so the nurse and Lena go into downtown Fort Worth on November 8th of 1911, and there they meet Al. And Lena and Al get on a train, and as far as Beale is concerned, they just disappear. Beale hires Pinkertons. He puts a reward out. By this time, it's sort of starting to get into the press. Not like it gets to be, but it's starting to get into the press. That was November 8th. In December 28th of 1911, they find them up in Winnipeg, Canada. It was a terrible winter. Here, I think they said snow was on the ground in the Panhandle for like weeks. They had, so you can imagine how bad it was in Canada. It was terrible. It was terrible.
So they
winter.
fled.
They fled. And everybody thought they were going to go south or maybe go to Cuba or Brazil or something like that. So I think they went the not obvious direction, which was north. And Al had ranched in Montana, and all those plains, going up into Canada, it's all kind of cowboy culture, even going up into that part of Canada. I think he probably felt, at ease with it. All of them had a fair amount of money. So this is a dispute among wealthy people, basically, which of course also made it juicy. Mm-hmm. And Beale goes hightailing it up to Canada and gets told, gun gets taken at the border. He gets told, you shoot him up here, you're going to hang, because we don't look at it the same way you look at it in Texas. Mm. And he gets the two of them arrested, tries to get them extradited, charges Al. He's meanwhile charged Al in Texas. He's charged him with, I want to say, rape and kidnapping. And it's got before the grand jury, but it hasn't been. He's trying to get him charged. Beale had trained as a lawyer, which is important because he knew how to manipulate all this stuff. He's also trying to get him charged in federal court with violation of the Mann Act, which is transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. You could be found guilty of that regardless of whether the woman consented. That was irrelevant. Didn't matter that she consented. So, and he had his aide in doing this was District Attorney Will Atwell, who was a relative by marriage and who was also the inspector of the post office and the USDA. So there's something like, now I worked for lawyers and I was like, how did somebody not see conflict of interest here? But I guess they didn't. So he's got Will Atwell working on that. He goes up to Canada, has Al charged in Canada with grand larceny because he said that Al had stolen Lena's diamond jewelry. Mm. Well, by this time, of course, the press has got a hold of it, both in Texas, and the Canadians are going, it's like,
what are we doing?
Well, and we've got these nutty Texans, it's like such drama, know, like we've got these, and they would write articles that said things like, the Texans with a, spare of words, but little respect for life. And I mean, it's pretty what you would think,
I know,
people
I love that.
Cliches about Texans,
And Canadians.
Mm-hmm. And totally on point, in fact, in this case.
Right.
So Beale manages to get Lena deported, and he basically meets her father in Minneapolis and says to her father, I want you to take her back to the sanitarium in Fort Worth. Mm. Somewhere along the line, she obviously talked her father out of that because she ends up in Clayton, New Mexico, where her father is living with her sister and her sister's husband. And she's still writing Al. Meanwhile, she's given the Boyce family power of attorney. So I did not realize this before I started researching this. But if you believe you have been confined in a mental institution without cause, you can bring you can try to get a writ of habeas corpus, just like you could if you thought you were in prison, charged in prison, and you hadn't been charged. So the Boyces can now get her out. They have power of attorney to get her out because what they're afraid of is that if they can't get her out, she can't testify to say that she's gone of her own free will,
right.
and that all these charges against Al will, there'll be grounds for these charges. And it's very clear that the Boyce parents were not happy about this whole situation. They didn't think their son should have done that, and I don't think they were, all that crazy about Lena, but they didn't want to see him charged with things they just thought were bogus.
Yeah, and not all of this.
The colonel especially was apparently infuriated by the diamond theft charge because he said, more or less, If he shoots him, I'm not going to say a word. He has a right to do that, but he has no right to say my son's a thief. So that's, I mean, that, my son is not a thief.
That's the mentality. Yeah.
My son is not a thief. He's not dishonorable in those ways. That got him in the game, supposedly. He'd been pretty hands off. He wrote a letter to the Canadian authorities saying, I hope you'll keep him there. We want to separate these two. But they have power of attorney. Lena gets really close to convincing her father, who had worked with the colonel, to go meet with him so that they can get this sorted out and figure out how to stand up to whatever Beale is doing. And somebody sends Lena's father a copy of an interview that the Boyces did in Fort Worth from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, in which Mrs. Boyce said, she's spoiled, she's always had her way, and some other things that her father took really, really badly, and said they have no right to talk about my daughter like that, and I will never meet that old man. So that was a point in the story in which things could have gone better had it not been, and it probably was Beale or somebody who sent this thing. So after that, the old man, her father, agrees to take her back to the sanitarium. Meanwhile, Beale has heard that the old man, Colonel Boyce, who had a rough way of speaking with the cowboys, is like hanging around on the corners in Amarillo, kind of trash talking, what we would call trash talking. I think, honestly, it was just, he probably was, it's just how men talk, when they're but this word got back to Beale that this was going on. So in the train going to Fort Worth from Clayton to take Lena to the sanitarium with her father, Beale knows the Boyces now have power of attorney, so they can try to get her out of the sanitarium. He knows that the old man has been trash-talking Lena. He gets to Fort Worth and discovers that the old man has managed to get the state charges, so he's not going to get charged with rape and kidnapping. So he and Atwell, the district attorney, who's also his lawyer, and the post office inspector, walk into the Metropolitan Hotel.
Judge, jury, and executioner.
Yes, exactly. Walk into the Metropolitan Hotel on this freezing cold night, and the Metropolitan was the fanciest hotel in Fort Worth, and just so happened to see the colonel sitting in a big chair in the lobby, getting ready to go home to Amarillo to say, okay, I got the charges dropped. And Beale walks right back out again. They go to dinner at a little supper place right down the street. And this part is really not clear, because it's not clear whether people were telling the truth in the testimony, but for some reason or another, Beale goes back to the Metropolitan, comes through the swinging doors, has a gun in his overcoat pocket. So sort of like now, it's open carry. He's got the gun in his overcoat pocket. Walks in, sees the colonel, probably as close as I am to you, and just shoots him. And so the colonel dies.
Wow.
So now this thing has really exploded, because it's not just, the guy's given $25,000 to get his wife back. Now he's actually killed.
Yeah, it's not just an ill-fated love affair.
No, and it's not just chasing somebody back and forth across, international lines. Wow. Now it's like you've murdered the former manager of the XIT.
Yeah.
And he's twice your age and sitting peaceably in his chair. What the heck were you doing? Everyone thinks Beale is going to get convicted because, this is...
He killed him.
He killed him. So at that point, he has his bond hearing, and she has her habeas hearing on the same day. In the same courtroom, before the same judge, the judge she has her examined by 3 alienists, is what they call them, and they're like, she's not crazy. And the judge says, I don't think there's any semblance of insanity, and I'm going to order her released now. Then Beale comes in, and they have a bail bond hearing, and a bunch of, people win his bond, and so he gets out. So Lena's now out. She doesn't find out, I guess, she didn't find out about the colonel being killed until they had her in front of the grand jury before her own habeas hearing, which was about 3 days after it happened. He killed the colonel on January 12th of 1912, January 12th, 13th of 1912. So now It's just a big mess. Beale's going to be tried.
Mm-hmm.
The Boyces have, back then, I guess you can, at least back in the 90s, you could still do it, is what I heard from a lawyer, but nobody does it that I know of. You could hire lawyers to help the state. I think now it would just be such a bad look, nobody would do it.
Oh.
But so they hired, there's all this big deal legal talent in the courtrooms because the Boyces are hiring big guns, and so are the Sneeds.
Yeah.
So they're just major names in the courtroom. You know, people who've been senators, people who've ran for governor, people, you know, they're all in the courtroom. And so at this point now, it is the newspaper coverage, which took me a long time to get. Back in the 90s, this was much harder. Now you just go online and find it. It's much harder to do. But the newspaper coverage, which is just voluminous and tiny print and pages and pages and pages. So it's, above the fold every single day.
I can imagine.
And the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, those reporters, they did an amazing job. It's just amazing job.
It's still around for a reason.
It's still around for a reason, but we don't depend on it as the media anymore. Now this would be filmed or whatever, but it's just amazing because there was so much bickering in the courtroom. I don't even know how they could keep it straight, you know, when they were writing things down. So basically, the case against Beale is obvious. I mean, we know what that is. But the defense lawyers end up spinning this thing that is completely based on emotion, not based on fact. And what it boils down to is he was defending his home and his poor, benighted wife, who's the victim of the chain-smoking, hard-drinking Al Boyce. Meanwhile, it seems like they are all smoking in the courtroom, except when the ladies were present. They could only smoke when the judge kicked the ladies out because he thought the ladies, whatever was going to come up, wasn't fit for their delicate ears, so they had to leave. And there was a lot of, like, what did the colonel actually say on the street of Amarillo testimony that wasn't appropriate for the ladies to hear, so they had to leave, and then the men would all get to smoke, and apparently they all smoked. But nonetheless, smoking was part of Al's problem. So Beale's team begged her to testify for him, and she refused to do it, and legally she could not testify against him. So when I started working on this, she was so interesting because she had almost no voice in it. They didn't quote a lot of the stuff that came out in her habeas hearing because they were protecting her, because a lot of it had to do with sex and stuff, so they didn't print it. And she wouldn't testify for her husband, and she couldn't testify against him. So the defense is saying, well, we just think the reason we don't have her up here is because she's so unreliable, because she's just crazy, and she's crazy because this man has had a malign influence on her. And my great uncle got up there and said, my goodness, I just had no idea anything was wrong with my marriage. I had a perfect home and a perfect family. And then all of a sudden she tells me this, and I just didn't know what to do. He was a fantastic witness. Remember, he was a lawyer, and he was but some lawyers might not be good witnesses. He was a fantastic witness. And he's got this all jurymen.
This is Beale.
Beale.
Yes.
In his trial.
Making sure
Beale. He's a great witness. He's got really smart lawyers. He's got 12 jurymen, all male.
Yeah, certainly jurymen.
And jurymen, all male, all white, all mostly married.
Yeah, I was going to say probably all husbands.
All Texas-born or Southern-born, because they wanted those. They did not want anybody from the North or any place that wouldn't understand kind of the Southern values that we're basically hammering on here.
Yeah, I guess certainly a jury of his peers.
It's a jury of his peers, right. It's a jury of his peers. So they managed to get it. The trial, it was just, for the times, very long. There's a ton of witnesses. The judge got really frustrated because there's just so much bickering going on with the lawyers, and there's bickering with him, and he doesn't like the main defense attorney, Bill McLean Jr. So it's a messy trial, which of course is just fodder for those newspapers, and everybody gets really worked up about it. At the end, the judge had to declare a mistrial because the jury hung. 7-5, to acquit him.
Wow.
They had managed to turn the story into this is what he had a right to do to defend his family and his home. And in Texas, we believe, and in the South, they really hammered on a lot of this is Southern. Which in Texas is very Southern inflected. A lot of this is Southern, and this trial is going on in Tarrant County. In Texas, we believe, and in the South, we believe that if a man insults a woman, as the colonel insulted Lena, her husband or brother, whatever male is her protector, has a right to kill him at the first opportunity that he sees him. Well, it wasn't the first time he'd seen him. I mean, none of it made any real sense. And they had all this testimony that made it clear that the colonel didn't approve, wanted them to keep Al in Canada. None of it mattered. They said the Boyce families are treating it like a cow transaction. They want to buy her. They're just trying to get her for their spoiled son. But it was ludicrous. It was just ludicrous. But it worked, at least enough to get him. And by the time the mistrial was declared, it had become such a hot spot, such a hot topic, are you old enough to remember the O.J. trial?
I'm just on the cusp.
Just on the cusp. So the O.J. trial, which blew up when I was starting to work on this, was a really good example of a case like this that becomes a total lightning rod for the society in which it's taking place, because the issues go way beyond did somebody kill somebody else.
Yes.
It's way beyond that.
Yes.
And so the O.J. case, having it happen at that time, it was an immediate reminder of what those kinds of cases are like and how people can get so worked up. People who have nothing to do with the case.
Yeah.
So people got killed over this. It like fights in streetcars over what was happening here. So very, very intense public feelings, which means that the whole society is engaged in this and something really big is being worked out or wrestled over. The judge absolutely wanted a conviction. He absolutely wanted a conviction. The guy shot him at point-blank range without provocation. The whole man was unarmed, but he didn't get it. So now you have this gap while they have to wait for the next trial. To me, Beale was a smart man. He's a very smart man. It could not have failed to have crossed his mind and his attorney's minds that he had a better chance of getting off for killing the old man if he killed the son, right? Because the son is the real perpetrator. If you say, oh, I killed the old man and then I never killed the son, you're not serious about it, right? It leaves some holes in that story. I'm not saying that happened, but I have a hard time believing that they did not recognize that it would be to Beale's advantage to manage to kill Al. Al was still up in Canada.
Yeah.
Lena had decided that she would go to California because her lawyer said to her, go someplace else, let this die down, and then file for divorce in California because you may be more likely to get it if you've established a residence someplace else, and he may, maybe he'll just get tired of this. So she goes to California. She and Al are corresponding. Remember?
Are they still together?
No, he's up in Canada.
No, I mean in a relationship.
Al and Lena, well, they haven't seen each other since they were separated up in Canada, but they're still writing.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Atwell, remember, was the post office inspector. So he's put a watch on some of the mail.
Are their letters getting out?
And their letters. So it becomes clear to Lena in California that her letters are being opened and being seen. And ultimately, I only found this out because of the research coup, which I'll get to, but involved getting a bunch of her letters. I only found out from the letters what must have happened, which is that Al came down from Canada, snuck into the country, met her in California. She, for some crazy reason, had decided to go back to Texas. And obviously she got him on the train and with her, which was amazing because they had somebody watching her. And at a certain point, he got off the train and I think went to El Centro, California, where his distant relative and former Texas Ranger and former XIT employee Ira Ayton was living. And Lena went off and had herself committed to a sanitarium in San Antonio. I think she's a nervous wreck. You can tell from the letter. She's just an absolute nervous wreck.
So she finds herself back in a sanitarium.
But she put herself back there. And so it's like, this is one of the big there's a bunch of turning points, a number of turning points. This is one of them, because she had just gone back to the place it was going to be the safest for Beale to kill her lover. Now, Al wasn't in Texas. He was in California. But eventually, of course, he comes back to Texas, too. She's, at some point, and it's not clear why, in the summer of 1912, makes the decision to go back to living with Beale. It's really, I had to make up in the novel what I thought happened, but it's really not clear what happened to cause that.
So she checks herself out of the sanitarium in San Antonio, moves back in with Beale.
More or less she does that. Meanwhile, Texas was such a small world, particularly I think Anglo-Texans with power, it's such a small world. So
sure.
One of Beale's big deal defense attorneys was Cone Johnson. His brother owned the sanitarium that Lena was in, and the head nurse was a friend of the Boyces who was sympathetic to Lena. It's like everything's so twined together. So it's not entirely clear what happens, but ultimately, and it's really not clear why he did it when he did it, but ultimately Beale decides to take Lena to the farm that was in my family in Milam County, that are the deep roots I was talking about, and basically confine her to the farm and the farmhouse there. He has a bodyguard that's watching her.
Wow.
And he has heard that Al is back and living at his mother's house on Polk Street. And so he grows a beard and dyes it black with shoe polish, takes a false name.
Al or Beale?
No, Al is back, and Al's living his life back in his mother's house on Polk Street. So Al's in Amarillo.
Yeah.
Lena's locked up on the farm in Milam County. Beale leaves from the farm in Milam County where he was born, has grown his beard, shoe blacks it, puts himself in crummy clothes, gets a kind of running buddy, and comes to Amarillo and rents a cottage right across from Polk Street Methodist, which at that time was located at 8th and Polk, and takes shades and puts them the wrong way around and nails them so he has a little peephole, puts a little mattress next to the peephole, and just watches. And on the third day, here comes Al, strolling down the street. He reaches the Methodist church. He says hello to the minister who'd buried his father. And Beale comes out with a shotgun and just fills him full of buckshot. And he's left on the street. I think he lost consciousness very, very quickly, but
just shoots him in the street.
In the street. He had a box. He comes across the streetcar lines, because they had streetcar lines then, opens up the box and starts firing. And poor Mrs. Boyce comes running up the street from their house. Who's done? And kneeling.
Who has buried her husband, and now this is her son.
Now this is her son. Almost 9 months to the day after by the same person after her husband has been killed. It's horrible. It's just awful. And Beale walks down to turn himself in to the Potter County jail. I think at this point quite confident that he's going to get off.
As he would be. He did for the dad.
Yeah, right. And also public sentiment had kind of turned in his direction. And some of the closing speeches in the Fort Worth trial are just astonishing. Like comparing him to Jesus Christ.
Oh my gosh.
Saying they're going to put up if we hang him, they're going to put up a statue that says he's a hero. I mean, it's astonishing. So Al dies, obviously. He's not going to live through that. And after that, there are 2 more trials. The second for, the retrial for killing the colonel. The judge this time tells him you have to find him guilty of first or second degree murder, or you have to acquit him entirely. They acquitted him entirely. The judge was not expecting it. They acquitted him entirely. Meanwhile, Lena, who was reportedly pregnant at the time that Al was shot, is kind of reported like to be like, she's out shopping with her daughter and they can't get to her. And the relatives say, but she's very happy. She's happier than she's ever been. And a few months later, at the beginning of 1913, they have the trial for killing Al in Vernon. And the jury member described it as a 10-minute verdict. We'd about made up our mind. And poor Mrs. Boyce is there. They won't, in all the trials, because of the rules of testimony, she could not say what she had heard Lena say. So there's a whole bunch of stuff she knew she couldn't say. And they would
because of hearsay or what?
Because of hearsay, right? Because of hearsay.
So
she knew things she would say Lena said, and they'd say you can't say it.
So in fact, no woman was ever allowed to say Lena went of her own accord.
No. Plenty of people did that. It was just Lena came to see Mrs. Boyce. There were all these things that Mrs. Boyce knew or wanted to say as Mrs. Boyce that she was not permitted to say because the defense would object and say it's hearsay. And the judge would have to say it is hearsay. So as you can, you just cannot imagine the degree of pain. And there's a just awful thing where she says, they tell her again in the Vernon trial, you can't say it. And she said, then this is not a trial. This is only a trial for the living. This is not a trial for the dead. I can't cry. My heart is dripping blood and my home is closed up and I can't tell you. It's awful. It's awful. So, and then Lena ends up living with Beale for the rest of her life. He died in 1960. She died in 1965. They're buried in Hillcrest Cemetery in Dallas. Their obits don't say a word about it. I actually talked to her sisters. There's some things I've left out. It's really hard to tell this story, and things get left out. Her sister in Louisiana had a grandson, and I talked to him because I was speculating that possibly she'd had the child in Louisiana. And he just said to me, Uncle Beale and Aunt Lena? He had no idea. None.
Wow.
None. And I was never able to figure out if there really was a child, what happened. If there was a child, did she miscarry, which she seemed to be prone to? Who knows? But it's just one of the things I said in the talk last night is that this is an amazing story. Great Texana and Pan, but it really transcends those categories because it involves absolutely everything about human nature and human society.
Totally.
It's absolutely everything. And I wanted to write with the novel, I wanted to set the novel in a context where it's not limited by, it's definitely colloquial, definitely regionally accurate and all those things, but I wanted a novel that somebody who is living in New York could read and say, I learned something about not just sex and violence, but something, about us, human beings, because it involves absolutely everything. It's Texas version of it, but it's absolutely everything that people do, and the way societies work and the kinds of ways that injustices are perpetrated. Although it's completely true that the fact that this ends up in court is progress. So that's the history.
What a story.
What a story.
Jeez Louise. Hey, Amarillo. If you've ever dreamed of a home that's not just built for now, but built for the duration, you need to know about For the Duration Homes. They're a family-owned, Panhandle-based builder crafting energy-efficient and beautifully designed spaces, from custom homes to remodels to pools. What I love is their commitment to community, transparency, and treating every project like it's their own. Check out their work at ftdhomes.com or listen to their podcast. Called The Home Innovation Show for design inspiration and building tips from right here in the Texas Panhandle. Do you think, man, it's so hard because it's a true story, so the answer might be, I don't know, which because you wrote the novel, but you wrote it on a real story. I'm just wondering so much about Lena.
When I began the novel, I think wanted to create a voice for her because she was so voiceless. And then in the most astonishing research coup of the entire thing, which is a whole story in itself if you want to hear it because it's quite interesting, I ended up with all those letters. So all of a sudden she had a lot of voice. And I learned things that nobody would have known had happened except through the letters.
How many letters?
Oh, my Lord. Gosh, it's been so long since I've looked at them. I can't, honestly,
I mean,
it was
12,
all,
50?
no, way more than that,
Okay.
50 something, maybe more than that.
Wow.
And she's scribbling them, like sometimes she's on the back of menus, she's scribbling them on train stuff, she's like scribbling on hotel stationery, she's scribbling on them ripped off paper if she's worried that she's going to get caught. These are very flawed people, and part of the reason this is such a mess is because the flaws just it was like a train wreck of personalities. If you tweaked any one of those people's personality a little bit, it wouldn't have happened the way it did. So that's one of the interesting things to me, is that it is definitely a story of injustice, but it's also really fundamentally a story of how human beings act. Because if these human beings had made different choices or just been wired a little differently, like Beale apparently, to me it looks like Beale, he knew his marriage was in trouble and they were talking about divorce before this happened. So what happened that made him just feel like, by God, it's not going to happen. I'm not giving her a divorce.
Well, maybe it's another man can't have her.
Yeah. I don't like another mule kicking in my stall.
That's
It's
right.
like and I think that's why I say it's a really fundamental human nature story, because that's people. We don't change. We haven't changed over millennia. We don't change. But Lena is definitely where I started. Like wanting to know more about her. And obviously I'm a woman. She's the easiest one to imagine my way into. But also I became the way I ultimately ended up structuring the novel. I have it from 3 points of view, hers to begin with, Beale's is the second point of view, and Al's is the third point of view. And each one of those sections more or less tells a particular part of the story. So there's a little shuttling back and forth. But basically each of those characters is responsible for moving the story to its end.
How hard was it for you to write through the perspective of like Beale in particular?
It was very hard. I really, this was so hard. I gave it up. The reason it took me so long.
It's been like 30 years.
It's been really a long time. I started it. I wrote Because This Is Texas, the nonfiction account, because people were starting to sniff around it. And by that time I was enough into the novel, thinking about it as a novel, that I really felt an obligation to the people who'd lived through it to write up an account that was nonfiction, that somebody would write, who could write, who wasn't going to make the mistakes some of the writers made of sensationalizing what's already a really sensational case. You don't have to gild the lily, and who had information that nobody else had. So I really thought I was going to write an article. It just ended up being a short book because as lean as I made it, I couldn't cut it down any further.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful to the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum for a review for publishing it. I had asked Fred Ratchen, the editor, because they'd been so helpful to me, and I'm really sorry that museum is closed. They'd been so helpful to me. I said, would you be interested in an article on this? And he said yes, but then I wrote this book. So I'm delighted that Blue Handle republished the book as a book, because it really always should have been in a book form. It just ended up in an article form, but that was kind of a sidelight. My mother died in very difficult circumstances, and I sort of hid into this hard part of my life, and I set the whole thing aside. I just thought, okay, I did, I did a good job.
What you felt called to do.
Well, no, I felt like I was letting the novel was what I felt called to do, but I felt like, okay, I have told the story in this nonfiction account. I did a good job of it, and so maybe that's all I'm going to do. Maybe I'm just not going to do the novel. I went and I wrote another novel, which isn't published, and then I sort of came back and was like, you kind of got to finish that thing. By that time, I had figured out I'm going to do the structure. I had a good base for Lena by that point. I had a very good base for Lena's voice by that point because I had started there. So I had a pretty good base with her. When I got these letters, I would always go out to Llano because they're all buried out there. And if you look at the epitaphs, it's very interesting on the Boyce family. They're all buried out there. And I would go out there and say, pay my respects, because I felt that was an important thing to do if I'm coming in as a member from the other family.
Yes, yeah, sure.
And I couldn't find any Boyces. They weren't in Amarillo, and it was back before you could Google people. You just have to try to find them in some other way. And I went out there to the cemetery on one of my visits, and I just stood at Al's grave, and I said, Al, I'm really having trouble with your family. I really need to find somebody. And I just am at a dead end. The next day, Mary Kate Tripp, who you may or may not, she was a wonderful, wonderful newspaper woman here in Amarillo, just a love. She called me up and she said, I have somebody else whose name I don't remember, and she'd like to know if you'd like to see the ranch headquarters in Channing, because there's a family up there. And I said, yeah, I'd love that. And I went up, and there's a picture of the colonel, and I said, oh, you have that picture of Colonel Boyce? And he said, yeah, that came from Pete Boyce. He's out in Manteca, California. It's about an hour and 15 minutes from where I live. And I was like, wow. Well, I knew they wouldn't give me his contact information because of who I was. But I said, here's my card. Please tell him I'm very sympathetic to what happened to his family, and I'd love to talk to him. And he called me. I was at work, at my desk, at the IT job, and the secretary sent this call through, and he said, this is Pete Boyce, and within 10 minutes, he said to me, we have a bunch of her letters. And I said, no, I had no idea. And he hadn't seen me, and I said...
But he knew your last name was Sneed.
No, he totally knew who I was.
Yeah.
And he had, somebody else had sniffed around the story from here, and he hadn't told him about the letters. So I said, well, what could what would you like for me to... And he said, just give me a copy of the newspaper, which was hard to get. So I transcribed all those letters. I saw a ring that she had given to Al, that they had, all this stuff, because Al had saved all those letters before he was killed. So Al, I felt close to in that way. His section was challenging because the way I imagined or felt that he was he was less verbal than the other two, that the other two were more verbal. So I had to find a way to talk about what he's going through without having him be as articulate about it.
So what has it been, certainly with respect to these people, because they're real people that are like current, talk a little bit more about, off the top, you talked about like one of the most lovely, perhaps unforeseen effects of this project for you have been to find some amount of reconciliation between the families.
Yeah. So Pete and I became friends. I wrote
Pete's
him.
the California guy.
Pete's the California guy. His real name is Albert G. Boyce. He was he's Al's great nephew, as I am Beale's great niece. So that was a weird little synchronicity.
Of course, and he's named directly.
Mm-hmm. And his son's name, Albert G. Boyce. They used that name. I mean, he and I became friends. But he was significantly older. And when I knew this book was coming out, I wrote him a letter and I said, I just know, you probably thought I'd, just given this up completely, but it is going to be published. I certainly don't expect you to do anything about that, but I wanted you to know that I'm still so grateful for that gift. Made all the difference, and that's not an exaggeration.
Totally.
Well, my letter kind of crossed with his death. And I got an email from his son saying that he had passed. He had a great life. And he had gone off to Germany to visit. His son was widowed, and his son had remarried to a German woman whose family had a farm in the Black Forest, I want to say. Went off to see the farming. I guess was having a nice little, his own wife was dead, having a nice little flirtation with one of the grandmothers or something.
Perfect.
And he came home and kind of went to sleep and died. So it more or less. So he had a really good life. And I went to his memorial service. So off the bat, that to me was amazing, because here Mike Beale had killed two Boyces, and no one had ever gone to any of their memorial services or any, there was no Sneed there. So I went to, be at this memorial service for this man. They had put me at a table that seating was assigned. It was out at the old ranch. It was just a beautiful, beautiful afternoon in California. And I said it to somebody who was sitting real early on, how I knew him. But basically, the minute you start on this, you can't get off it, right? I mean, talk about pulling focus,
Sure.
So I would just say, oh, he helped me out with some research. If people said, how do you know him? Just to not get into it.
Yes.
But this woman who was at the table, his name was Cameron, she said, you're Clara Sneed, aren't you? And I said, yes. And she said, oh, my mother and I just loved your book, because this is Texas, the article. And she and her mother came to Amarillo for my debut with that book from Virginia. You know how hard it is to get to Amarillo from Virginia? In December.
Gosh.
Not an easy. So I was so touched by that. And then when Cameron finished the novel, she bought a bunch of them, and she said, I can't tell you how much I love this book. Like you, I've known this story basically my whole life, and some other lovely, but she said, your novel captured the persistent sense of pain that this has had for my family over the generations. That it still makes me cry. It was amazing to me. It was amazing to me. So, and she and I are, we're in communication. They interviewed with Lloyd on the podcast, and so it's an amazing thing to me. All the work and all the things that I might want for the novel and everything else, but it's this extraordinary reconciliation and healing of something that was really, really dark. And here's this healing coming out. So it's nice. It's lovely.
I'm thinking about, some of the reading or talking or research around generational trauma that we do, in fact, carry the trauma.
That's totally on point.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, totally on point. And I think even if it's my family and you're not paying in the same direct way because you're not, your people haven't been killed, you've got the killer, there's still payment. My grandmother was so mad at Beale and didn't think much of Lena, but she was furious at Beale for putting Lena on the farm because she thought he was endangering her family. Because she thought the Boyces, everybody's worried about this. It's going to be a hot feud. The Boyces are going to retaliate. And she just didn't approve of it. She just didn't approve of the whole thing.
It was pretty messy.
It's pretty messy, and she didn't approve of Lena, and she didn't like Beale. And my dad knew Beale, and my dad knew this part of the family, but they were always kind of holding Beale a little apart because they didn't trust him. He was an operator. But I didn't know them because I just think they were like, we don't need to have you around. But I remember, I think way, way, way back in my memory is some cousin saying to me, do you know you have a relative who killed somebody? But I basically don't remember not knowing some version of this story that, and a lot of it was, the predictable thing. He killed the man she had the affair with, the colonel kind of got left out. It was a much more simplified story. But I remember a family reunion, the MC brought it up and my grandmother was furious. She was absolutely furious about it because she thought that generation just didn't talk about it. That's why in the 90s, people started to sniff around because they could. Before that, they just wouldn't talk about it. And there's a book called I'll Die Before I Run. It's a Sonneshan book about classic feuds, and it mentions it, and it just said, it's too soon to talk about them. It's too hot. His theory about feuds was people don't talk about them because it's a way to try to damp the feud down.
Sure.
He said the Sneed boys feud in Amarillo, this was early 50s, just too hot to talk about. You can't. So by the 90s, people were starting to talk about it because there was still a woman when I was trying to do my research in the 90s that somebody tried to line up an interview and she said, I don't want to talk to her. And my friend said, well, why? And she said, honey, we just didn't regard destroying a woman's reputation lightly. That was why she didn't want to talk to me.
Hmm.
So it's that old, sense of what's appropriate and how hard it is to be a woman in a certain situation and not have a reputation. I think in some ways people have said to me, well, why do you think she stayed with him? And I'm like, well, just try to think what her choices were. She didn't
and
have a lot.
how much she went through when she tried to not.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about her going, of her own volition back into the sanitarium and then ending up back with him. Like, well, hell, it was real hard when she didn't.
No, exactly. And he would have made sure that she didn't see her kids.
She lost the love of her life to murder.
Yeah, and she doesn't see her kids, and she's not, and her reputation is going to be shredded.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things I sort of said in the talk last night is, it's really easy to write books that flatter the audience of the time by making people look like you put them back in history, but you say, well, they were really like you. You're really right about stuff. This woman was like real plucky, and you would be plucky like that. It's not true. Most of us aren't that plucky. She fell in love with somebody madly. She probably thought she had a little more strength than she actually had. She wasn't a career woman. She didn't want to go have a career. She just wanted to be married to Al Boyce. And who knows how that would have even worked out if she'd married him. But she wasn't like casting a blow for female freedom. She was just wanted to marry this other man. And I think Beale just wore her out.
At the end of the day, she does also have to survive.
She has to survive, and she's not going to see her children. And the kids were a real issue because he really made sure she didn't see the children. She sent them presents, and he didn't give them to her. He made sure that she was always watched. It's just, he just had ways. He's very manipulative. And he had ways of making sure that she was going to be deprived, and then she can't communicate with the lover because he's got the mails watched.
Literally the postman.
Literally the postman. She was terrified by the ocean in California. They started out at Long Beach, and she had to leave because she hated the ocean. And she said, California's beautiful with its fruits and flowers, but it's not for me. She just, and it was so cheap back then. They had a room in L.A. fully furnished with something like 4 rooms for $25 a month. But yeah, I think if there were, any screen treatment, anything like that, the focus would definitely be on Lena because it's where the zeitgeist is now. She's the obvious linchpin of the story in some ways. And
is that the industry way of saying, like, if we were going to make it a movie?
I don't know anything about this industry. I'm such a reader, so I don't know if that's the industry way. I just think people have talked about movies and people have talked about miniseries, and so I don't know what you call that. Like something that's not a book, that is.
Has there been any of that? I mean, it sounds like a movie.
Everybody says it, and there's certainly some action that people are trying to get going about getting some kind of screen treatment of whatever form it might be. There's always a fun game of who would you cast as each one of the characters, and it's like totally changed. The person I would have cast back in the 90s, although he maybe would have been a little old then, to play Beale would be Robert Duvall. I think Robert Duvall would have done a beautiful job with Beale, even looking physically right. Mm-hmm. But now I don't know who would you cast as Beale? It's like, who would you cast as Lena? Mm-hmm. Lena's got to be just a little crazy.
So, Clara, I'm wondering, this story obviously is like very central to your familial identity, but so far as like a work project, you've been working on this for like 30 years.
So ridiculous.
And the thing is public.
Off and on.
Okay, sure. So the thing's published now.
Yes.
You're obviously doing some speaking engagements and kind of working the book a little bit. When did the book come out?
The novel came out in December 2024, and Because This Is Texas was republished as a book in June of 25.
Okay. Is there a time when you are not working on this project in some form?
That's a good question. I have other things that I've done a little thing since then. I've written other things. I did a whole other novel. But given my age and given my desire to do what I avoided, because I really was weirdly uninterested with the publishing aspect of all of this stuff. And finally, one of my friends said, I was saying, I had a writer's block, but I got over it. And she goes, the not publishing is part of the block. And it was like, oh, you know what? She's right. And so I'm committed now to doing the best I can for this book, both in terms of marketing. I think I produced 2 good books. I believe in both the books. They're not going to be for everybody, but I believe that they're worthy pieces of work. I don't imagine I'll be out of that before I turn to dust, because if I had 30 years ahead of me, then the answer might be different, but I don't have 30 years ahead of me. So do I want to get to the point where some of this I can let aside and just go ahead and dig into another project? Absolutely, I want to do that.
The thing I am left wondering is, did you devote so much time to telling this story historically accurately as perhaps a way to maybe apologize, maybe give platform to it from your perspective in the families?
Yeah.
Is there a part of that?
I think there...
To maybe make it better?
Yes, I'm certain that was in there. I don't believe it was in there terribly consciously initially. I just thought, this is a really good story. I've been writing poetry. I think I'm going to tackle a novel, and this would be a good place to start, which was crazy. Like, I had no idea what I was getting. It's just like, oh yeah, let's have a toddler at home and a job, and let's do that too. That's a
Pop
really
into
good...
this for a few years.
What was I thinking? But it was such an obvious story to take on. If you're going to do a novel, this was
this amazing
amazing
totally.
story, amazing story. And then initially, I think I thought, well, I kind of want to do something for her because she doesn't have this voice. But then that changed because she did have this voice, but also because I started seeing more and more. The story just is so vast in terms of what it involves. But I also believe that there are things that, like the Shakespeare line has it, there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them as we may. And I think that's very true. So I think there's probably that impulse inside of me, whether it was conscious or not. And I certainly felt from the beginning that I really wanted to do these people justice. I still can't entirely explain to myself why I felt so strongly that I wanted to stick as close as I possibly could to the historical record, because it's a little bit of a weird choice, right? There's a lot you could do with this in terms of fiction, but I have just never, ever, ever thought anything except I'm going to do the very best I can to not make things up. I've made things up in the novel. Obviously, you have scenes and everything else that you have to make up, but I stuck to the chronology. And a lot of the stuff that's is verbatim, in the courtroom stuff. But the other really interesting thing is that mostly I draft by hand. The other novel I drafted by hand. When I draft, sometimes I don't, but mostly I draft by hand. I never did with this story. And it took me a really long time. And I probably didn't figure that out until maybe 6 or 7 years ago, why that was the case. And what I figured out is it gave me a little protection. Like the hand was closer. And doing it on the computer, it was my way, without my being aware of it, of protecting myself a little bit from the energy in this story, because it's really intense energy in this story. Right? Even if it's 1912. And it is familial. But even if it weren't familial, it's still, extremely intense. So I think it's in there. I just don't think it's probably was as conscious, and I'm not sure it would have been as good a book if it had been conscious, because if you've got that as a goal, the goal is you want to write the best book you can.
Even a lens.
Yeah, because you might pull your punches or do something to be less
accurate.
Yeah, and accurate artistically, just so. But I think it's certainly in there. I think that's it. You're not wrong. It's just probably not in there. It wasn't in there as a conscious thing. It was just like, oh, I need to keep myself out of trouble. And I was writing poetry, but I think I'll write a novel. And so this would be a good, just insane. And here we are. I got it done before I turned to dust.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Better late than never.
Does your marketing feel like a shot in the dark? Are your social media posts getting lost in the scroll? Unlock your business's potential with SKP Creative. They know your audience and design posts that reflect your brand and drive real engagement. From scroll-stopping social media content to powerful traditional marketing, graphic design, and website development, SKP Creative covers it all. Are you ready to elevate your feed and turn your marketing into a success story? Visit skpcreative.com today. Okay, I'm back with Clara Sneed. Clara, this is a part of the show I call 8 Straight. I've got 8 fast ones for you. Also, like, super fair, and sometimes I like a different perspective. These are like hyper Amarillo questions, and you don't live here.
Some of them I can't answer. I already went through them. Some of them I can.
Although you've spent a good amount of time
I've
here.
spent a good amount of time.
So you got some perspective.
Yes, I do.
Okay. When you think of Amarillo 10 years from now, what do you hope for?
Okay, so this is the one that I really can't weigh in on, except that I always hope for more independent bookstores, more readers, more books, and if we're handing your better public schools.
I will not argue with you on any one of them.
I always hope for those.
Yes, ma'am. When was the last time you went to Paladero Canyon?
Well, interestingly enough, my husband was just there this morning, but I probably went there within the last year.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah.
That's better than a lot of my guests.
We love going down there, and I keep trying to get what is the monkey thing?
Sad Monkey Mercantile.
Sad Monkey. I'm trying to get my books in there because they have a really well curated little thing there. My books would fit perfectly, and it's like, come on, boys.
Yeah.
Let's get them in there.
We'll have to make that happen.
Yes.
Other than wind, what does this area have too much of?
It's interesting. I asked that question last night to the group because I said I have no idea, and somebody came up with gas stations. But the one I would want to say, and this is not like, okay, this is not fair, but every time I'm here, 40 or 27 are torn up.
That is not a you thing. Okay.
Okay. So too much of that.
We do have a lot of road construction these days. What do we not have enough of?
Well, I'm always going to say, I'm always going to say books, libraries, independent bookstores, because I just think there should be more of those anywhere.
Everywhere,
So I'm going to stick with that one.
Yeah, cool. Although we've got some great ones.
You do. And,
Totally.
And when I get to the recommendation, I'm coming up with one of them.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah.
What's your favorite local building?
What's my favorite local?
Local building.
Oh, I think the Barfield.
Yeah.
I like the Barfield, yeah.
Totally. Favorite local restaurant?
I want to say, excuse me, because I've had lovely family meals with Bob Brent's Public House, because he's one of my relatives. So that one. And then the one that's like O2 or something that's there near the Barfield. It's a good
OHMS?
one. HMS.
Yeah, OHMS.
I don't know why I get the O2 in my head, but OHMS. I like that one a lot too.
For not being a local, those are 2 very good local picks.
Well, I've been, okay, good.
Yeah, very good. Public House and OHMS are great. Okay, you have 4 hours to spend in Amarillo with someone who's never been here.
Okay, so this is going to be off the wall, but I thought about this one. So somebody who's never been here, the first thing I would do is take them out to see Cadillac Ranch, because Cadillac Ranch, when I started coming here, was so different, and the effect of it was entirely different because it was out there in the middle of nowhere. Mm-hmm. So it had that extra art factor that it no longer has because it's contained in the field. I'd want somebody to see that, just to imagine, if you're ever thinking about how art like this might work, the setting in this case makes a huge difference, and the people putting it there thought about the setting, and now the setting has changed. So now it's something quite different than it was, so I'd start there.
That's a really cool perspective.
I would start there. Then I can't go far enough back on 40 in my trip through Amarillo. But it used to be that the personal injury lawyers were good for such great, hilarious billboards. They no longer are. But I absolutely adore the little handcuffed gummy bear with 1844 Tex Weed.
That's right.
But the one I really love is back there on 40 with, "Welcome to Texas. Now you're a felon."
Oh, God.
And the little sad gummy with it.
Yeah.
So I would make sure that they saw some of those because they just scratched that former PI lawyer itch that no one ever scratches anymore, and I adore them. Then I think if we were doing if the sod poodles were playing, I would have them go at least for, an inning or two. We'd go over in that lovely new stadium, which I still haven't had a chance to do, and see a bit of a baseball game because I think that would be fun. So that would probably take up a fair amount of time. I would want to end in the speakeasy at the Barfield having a drink with all those books because I love the Barfield also from having the books. I think that would take up about 4 hours. I think trying to get down to the Palador would maybe be too much. That would be a really good thing, but I think we can't fit that into 4 hours.
Look, just the I-40 billboard tour is like the most unique and wonderful thing.
Well, there's some other really interesting billboards.
Oh, girl,
out there.
I know.
Yeah, but that little handcuffed gummy bear just makes me laugh. So a little sad gummy bear with his handcuffs.
Yeah. All right, finally.
And then I guess also if they were interested, we could drop them off at 8th and Polk, although it doesn't look anything like where Al was killed.
Does it not? Finally, what do you think people get wrong about Amarillo?
Amarillo really grew on me. It really ended up growing on me. But I think people, maybe even in Texas, but definitely outside of Texas, just think of it as you drive right on through. Maybe they think of the Big Texan, but mainly they think of I-40.
Yeah.
And maybe they think of Cadillac Ranch. And I just don't think people realize how interesting Amarillo is. It really is a very interesting place. People are wonderful here. They really are. But it's also just a really interesting and unique place like when I was researching it, Pantex was still doing the final assembly of nuclear weapons, and it was kind of blew up because the Catholic bishop had said we shouldn't be doing this, and it just was a big mess. And this woman wrote a wonderful book about it called Blessed Assurance, the Bomb in Amarillo, Texas. It won awards. It was a really good book.
Okay, write that down.
But yeah, it's a really good book, it'll take you back to more of that period of Amarillo. But I just thought it's astonishing that you have a place that's settled so late in American history. You really don't have much of anything going on here in terms of Anglos or Goodnight or anything like that until you get into the 1870s. And now you get to the 1970s and you're doing the final assembly of nuclear weapons. It's quite astonishing. If you're thinking about basically the Comanche and the Comancheros and a sort of Stone Age thing, and then here you are at Pantex. It's sort of mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing to me at the time. And now it's grown so much. It's so much bigger than it was when I started and so much more. But I think people just think, oh, I'm just going to blow on through.
Totally.
Hit one of the many gas stations. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as decent food in Amarillo. You can't get a decent, you couldn't get a decent drink. Just all that stuff, you can't, or people are just, I don't know what they think, but a lot of it's wrong, I think.
Clara, I like to end these episodes by asking my guest to endorse something.
Yes.
What is it that you would endorse?
So first thing I want to endorse is the publisher Blue Handle Books, because I think they do a beautiful job and people don't really, something Amarillo ought to be proud of, that they have a really first-rate independent publisher here in Amarillo that are a dream to work with if you're the author, and also produce really beautiful books. They don't sell a lot of Kindle because the books themselves are so beautiful. People buy the books. So I think I'd like to do that. I'd also like to do a shout out to Dallas's new Burrowing Owl outlet here in Amarillo, because she's just lovely and she did the debut. And I would like, because one of my other passions is fashion, I love Monkeys, the boutique at Wolfland, Little Boutique.
Yes.
Yes, Monkeys.
It's new, right?
I don't know how new it is, but I love it. And I love Deb at Monkeys. She's great.
Okay, go see Deb at Monkeys.
Go see Deb at Monkeys. Yeah, tell her Clara sent you.
I will.
No, seriously. It's not cheap, but they are really fun clothes. And so those are my 3 recommendations.
Thank you.
Go
Clara,
see
thank
Debit.
you for telling this wild story about this place, and then for sharing it with us here.
Well, thank you so much for having me and being such a wonderful interviewer and listening to all the craziness.
Looking for the perfect date night? The Amarillo Symphony presents Romance at the Symphony, featuring the passion of Romeo and Juliet, the excitement of West Side Story, thrilling music from Gone with the Wind, plus soprano Sarah Beckham Turner singing beloved opera arias. It is perfect for this Valentine's season. Tickets at amarillosymphony.org. And that concludes this episode. Thanks to Clara for the interview. Thank you to For the Duration Homes, SKP Creative, and the Amarillo Symphony for supporting the podcast, and to Broderick Adams for editing every week. And thank you for listening. This has been episode 441 of Hey Amarillo. I'm Skylar Gallup, and we hope you'll come back next week.